Hi everyone. In this video I'd like to talk about the trauma bond. So this is something that's really difficult to understand, isn't it? Why is it that we can come from a dysfunctional childhood and then we wish to be loved and have a nice relationship, and then we end up in a relationship which is pretty similar to the one that we came from in childhood, and then we find that we can't escape it as well, or it's very difficult to escape, or it takes a lot of work to be able to escape it because we kind of feel trapped in it. How do we explain this psychological bond that we have with someone that's so hard to break? So let's have a look at an article on my website. My website is called childrenofnarcissists.org.uk and the article is called The Trauma Bond. Let's go and have a look. Most of us are familiar with the term trauma bond, but what does it actually mean? How can we explain the feeling that many people have of being very unhappy in a relationship, feeling at times that they really want to leave it and being determined to do so, but they feel they're somehow stuck, frozen or trapped and they just can't leave? Even when the relationship gets worse and worse over time and they end up tolerating situations that they didn't ever think they would, they still don't leave. Why does this happen? So how can we define a bond? First of all, we can say it's a close connection joining two or more people. In chemistry, it's a force holding atoms together in a molecule. So I include that here because it kind of feels like that, doesn't it? It's a force that's out of control, out of our conscious control. And also the ropes or chains that hold prisoners and prevent them from moving around or escaping. So I've included that one as well because it can feel like that, can't it? That we just can't break away. So what does a healthy bond look like, first of all? So to understand what a healthy bond looks like, we need to understand the mindset of a person who's able to have healthy relationships. And that is someone who is nurtured in childhood in such a way that they developed a sense of self that is based on one's true inner feelings, preferences, reactions and capacities. It emerges over time through contact with the environment that allows for its expression. It includes a sense of the ways in which one is unique and also the ways in which one is the same or differs from others. It is based on reality and therefore it is relatively resilient and stable, although it evolves in response to experiences. And that definition is by Eleanor Greenberg, PhD, and she was a student of James Masterson. James F. Masterson, MD, was a psychiatrist who specialised in narcissistic and borderline personality disorders. In his book, The Search for the Real Self, he defines a list of capacities or mental abilities that healthy individuals have, which enable them to lead a fulfilling life and to have deep, authentic relationships. To be able to have a healthy relationship, Masterson states that we need to have the capacity to express the real self fully in a close relationship with another person, with minimal anxiety about abandonment or engulfment, and the ability to self-soothe this anxiety. So of course, when we've come from a narcissistic family, we're going to have that fear quite strongly that we're going to be taken over and controlled, engulfed, or we're going to be neglected, rejected, ignored, or abandoned. So James Masterson also says, the ability to be alone. The real self allows us to be alone without feeling abandoned. It enables us to manage ourselves and our feelings on our own through periods when there is no special person in our lives, and not confuse this type of aloneness with the psychic aloneness springing from an impaired real self that drives us to despair, or the pathological need to fill up our lives with dead-end relationships just to avoid coming face to face with the impaired real self. And then to have a healthy relationship, we also need to have the capacity for self-activation and assertion. This capacity involves the ability to identify one's own unique individuality, wishes, dreams and goals, and to be assertive in expressing them autonomously. People who have a strong and stable sense of self are able to have healthy personal relationships based on mutual respect. Both parties can set boundaries which will be honoured, and communication is assertive and not aggressive. Emotions can be regulated and there is a recognition and respect for the needs, wants, thoughts and feelings of the other person. Inner feelings can be talked about without the fear of rejection or humiliation. Both parties want the best for themselves and the other person, and the relationship is not about power, control, dominance, submission, or winning and losing. So this is what a healthy relationship looks like, is the opposite from the kind of relationships we have when we're growing up in a narcissistic family. So what does an unhealthy bond look like? People who are in dysfunctional relationships are going to have an impaired real self. This means for children growing up in a narcissistic family, the real self could not develop in a healthy way as the environment, which is the parents, did not allow for its expression and nurturing, and therefore it is impaired, which means it is diminished, damaged, functioning poorly or weakened. A core belief develops in the person that if someone could see the real me, they will reject me, and there can be a lot of shame. Yeah, so there's something so inherently wrong with my character. It's been rejected since I was a small child, and we're going to disconnect then from that stuff, and we're going to bury it, but also it wants to grow naturally. So there's kind of a constant struggle going on between that part of ourselves wanting to develop and us trying to repress it. Similar people are attracted to each other, and therefore in a dysfunctional relationship, two people with an impaired sense of self are present, and this is the foundation of the trauma bond. Or another way to look at this is that there are two people having a relationship and they're both in an adapted version of themselves, and they're not quite in touch with that authentic version of themselves. It takes a long time to be able to get to know that real self, that version of us, when we've come from dysfunctional families, because there's a lot to work through to be able to get there. There's lots of layers of defences that we've built over time to keep us stable and functioning. A trauma bond can be defined as an unhealthy attachment between two people in a relationship which one or both people find very difficult to break. They may feel they are happily married for a long period of time and may not be aware that there is an unhealthy bond, or the relationship may be volatile or up and down. We can see the negative effects of the trauma bond in a situation where there is perhaps a violent episode, or one partner is being unfaithful, or there is some other unpleasant incident. The person who has been on the receiving end may feel indignant and determined or desperate to leave, and they either still cannot leave, or they may be able to extricate themselves for a short period of time, but they will go back, and this can happen repeatedly. This can feel confusing for the person who wants to leave but can't. So it's really confusing, isn't it? Dysfunctional relationships tend to deteriorate over time, and we end up tolerating behaviours that would have been unthinkable many years before. What does a trauma bond feel like? So dysfunctional relationships can take many forms, often but not always. People who have had a narcissistic parent will go on to have dysfunctional relationships in adulthood, often with narcissists. On a superficial level, it's hard to make sense of this. Why would people repeat the pain of their past? We consciously wish for a fulfilling, happy relationship and yet end up with the opposite. Why? People often describe someone they have just started a relationship with and who they will end up trauma bonded with as their soulmate or perfect. In the beginning, both parties often idealise each other, and it can be intense, obsessive, and move very quickly. The relationship then develops into being unstable, intense, and usually on and off again. And alternatively, the relationship can be on and off again from the beginning. So everyone's different, and we all have our own version of how we have relationships. A trauma bond can be described as being like glue. It can feel like it's impossible to get away, even when the bar gets lowered over time as to what is accepted in the relationship. So as the relationship devolves and deteriorates and gets more and more dysfunctional or more and more devaluing. There are many reasons why people end up trauma bonded in dysfunctional relationships. They are held in them for emotional, biological, and psychological reasons, the circumstances for which are set up in childhood. So there have been some experiments done on rats. So rat pups, like humans, have a biologically predetermined attachment system in the brain. Experiments have been conducted on the pups, which shed light on the processes which go on in terms of how mammals attach to abusive parents. In the following experiment, rat pups had stressed mothers and or learned to associate the smell of their mother with pain, so they were electric shocked. This paper is named Fear in Love, Attachment, Abuse and the Developing Brain. Rats are similar to children in that they have a biologically predetermined attachment system in the brain, but must learn to identify and remember the caregiver. For this reason, we began to use attachment learning in rats to question, what is it about an infant's brain that supports attachment, even when the caregiver is abusive? An early clue was the involvement of the brain chemical norepinephrine. The neurotransmitter is released in massive amounts at birth and during bonding with the mother. It is also released when a young animal is in pain. This dual role for norepinephrine set us on the path to explore the fundamental and puzzling question of why a child cannot learn to break the attachment to an abusive caregiver. After all, when humans and all other mammals experience pain, they learn to avoid anything that warns of the pain so that they can prevent it next time. So, in an abusive relationship, why doesn't the pain activate the brain's fear and avoidance circuits? Simply and amazingly, the brain area responsible for fear and avoidance learning is not turned on by pain in pups not old enough to leave the nest. Even more amazingly, in older pups that live in the nest but also explore outside the nest, this brain area shuts off only when the pups are with the mother. The key to the young rat pup's behaviour is an almond-shaped structure known as the amygdala, a part of the brain involved in emotionally charged memories, especially fearful ones. And they found that the amygdala in people who've had trauma is swollen. So it's an irritated amygdala. It's larger than the size of an average person's amygdala because there have been more resources devoted to it in childhood because it's been needed a lot. The presence of the mother during a painful event is enough to suppress activity in the amygdala of a rat pup. The mechanism proved to be surprisingly simple. Pups still living in the nest or older pups in their mother's presence did not release the stress hormone corticosterone. The infant amygdala is uniquely dependent upon increases in corticosterone to learn and express fear. In a later study, we showed that the neurotransmitter dopamine is also released when the rat is learning to avoid the odour. Though dopamine is often considered a reward chemical, when increased in the amygdala, it helps to form fear-related memories. In this study, young rats still in the mother's nest showed a large decrease in dopamine in the amygdala, indicating a mechanism to further block pups from learning to fear. The benefits of this maternal off switch seem obvious. Nearness to the mother offers comfort and courage in what might otherwise be a frightening situation, serving to strengthen the bond between mother and infant and to remind an older child where its haven is in times of danger. This phenomenon is known as social buffering, and it continues throughout life. When a child gets an injection, the presence of a parent can help the child cope with the pain. Later on, when someone we care about is there to comfort us in a stressful situation, our stress hormones and fear are greatly reduced. The switch is flipped, however, when the intrepid older rat pup is out exploring. Then the threatening event sparks the fear response, propelling the youngster away from danger and preferably back into the nest while searing an indelible memory into the brain. But when the parent and the nest are themselves sources of danger, the suppression of fear circuits in the amygdala unfortunately still works. The fear, avoidance, and even memories associated with pain are extinguished, explaining why an abused child, even when trying to escape pain, will later seek contact with the abuser. Traumatic experiences such as abuse can work their way into a child's genes. This fact may come as a surprise, since most of us think of genes as something we are born with. Of course, the genetic material we receive from our parents is important and lays the foundation for who we are and what we become. But how our parents treat us as we grow can greatly influence the way the genetic material is read and used. Think of our genetic material as a vast library of information. The way this information is accessed and what ends up being done with it depend in great part on our early life experiences. Clinging behaviours, the trauma bond. Masterson writes extensively about the clinging behaviours in childhood and adulthood of people who come from narcissistic families. There will also be rebellious and distancing behaviours present at times. Yeah, so of course there's the clinging, and then there are also, part of that, which is often a disorganised attachment. There'll be distancing behaviours, and then also we go into fight. We stand up for ourselves sometimes, occasionally, lots of times in people pleasing, oscillating between the two. So everyone's going to have their own picture, their own mental makeup of their own coping mechanisms and how they are. For many people, clinging and dependent behaviours feel good, as does meeting other people's needs, and being independent and autonomous feels bad. So that's a general statement. It's not always applicable, but to parts of us, and on some level, that's true. So those clingy, independent parts of us feel good when that's happening, and then feeling independent and autonomous feel bad, because that's going to be activating our real self, isn't it? So James Masterson says, even as adults, people with a deflated false self will feel as they did when children. Bad, guilty, ugly, helpless, inadequate, and empty for never asserting themselves. And they will only feel good and actually loved when they are passive, compliant, and submissive to the person to whom they cling for emotional supplies. Caught in this, their emotional lives are characterized by chronic anger, frustration, and feelings of being thwarted. The abandonment depression continually lurks around the corner, and the false self prevents the person from turning that corner. So our adaptive self, our defenses, keep us there because it feels safer than being our real self. In that quote, Masterson speaks of a deflated false self. So this is related to people with a more codependent psychological makeup. When he addresses people with narcissistic personality disorder, he describes them as people with an inflated false self. The false self can also be described as an adapted self, and it can be defined as a constructed sense of identity that is now misidentified as the person's real self. It is based on fantasy and input from others, especially early caregivers, and is designed to defend against unpleasant feelings and please other people. However, because it is not inherently and deeply true, it is vulnerable to outside influences and is easily disturbed. That quote's by Eleanor Greenberg again. The abandonment depression. The abandonment depression is Masterson's term for the overwhelmingly unpleasant feelings that surface when a people with an impaired real self tries to self-activate. This means to express their own wants and needs, and this can trigger a suicidal depression, a rage, guilt, panic, emptiness, helplessness, and hopelessness. These emotions will then guide people back into their defenses, so people-pleasing and serving the needs of others. The fear of abandonment. The fear of abandonment is a strong force in keeping people in dysfunctional relationships. It's a deep-seated fear of being left by people that you are close to. This fear affects your thoughts and behaviours, and it's related to the avoidance of feeling the abandonment depression. So if we think of it as layers, we have our adapted self on the top, that false self, inflated or deflated. Then under that we have the abandonment depression, which kind of separates the two. So then we have our adapted self on top, and then if we dip down on our way down to the real self, where our own wants and needs live, then that's going to trigger that abandonment depression feeling, which is comprised of all of those feelings I just mentioned, and then that's going to nudge us back up into that adapted self again. So protects us from that pain underneath, and then our impaired real self lives down there also. People with a fear of abandonment may feel that they have to give more than they take from others. They may be chronic people pleasers, which can lead to an imbalance of power in relationships. Alternatively, they may try to control their partners through wanting to know where they are most or all of the time, or they may use threats. They may be envious of other people's relationships. They may feel anxious and worried a lot of the time and may need frequent reassurance that their partner is being faithful or will not leave them. They may feel very jealous. They may sometimes have clinging behaviours and at other times push their partner away. So it can be really good to look at attachment theory to understand why those things happen. Adults who are afraid of being abandoned may be preoccupied with working hard to keep their partner from leaving and put a lot of effort into the relationship. They may then worry that their partner does not appreciate or reciprocate their efforts. Guilt and clinging. Many children of narcissists will be very familiar with the strong feelings of guilt that can come along in everyday life when they do things for themselves. Others avoid the guilty feelings by spending a majority of their time in service to others, keeping very busy or working. So, sometimes we get the urge to do things we want. A lot of the time we don't even know ourselves at all. We don't even know what we like to do or what we want to do. And when we are having a time when we're not busy or working, there can be a sense of feeling a bit lost or adrift because we don't know ourselves. We don't know what to do with our time. Guilt is the fifth column of 6, the others being depression, panic, rage, helplessness and emptiness. Behind the patient's front line of defences, the guilt is not the reasonable guilt that a person feels when he genuinely does something that he believes is wrong. Guilt that is appropriate for an injury or harm caused to another. Appropriate guilt for the right reasons and in the right degree oils the wheels of society and keeps us civilised. This guilt is another matter. It is fed by the guilt we internalise in early childhood from the disapproval expressed by the mother or father for self-actualisation or individuation. These are terms for discovering, asserting and becoming our unique selves. It is then reinforced later in childhood and in adolescence, and even after striking out on our own, a strong reprimanding voice fixed in the psyche, reminiscent of parents, teachers and authority figures from the past, can echo down the corridors of time in our daily lives when we entertain those special thoughts and wishes we know would, in the past, elicit disapproval. The real self's genuine urges, however, like starting a new career, beginning a relationship with someone, moving out of town, spending an evening away from the family, or spending a little extra money on a new hobby or pastime, should not produce guilt feelings. When the false self, or our adapted self, is solidly in control, those harmless natural desires for self-expression can trigger the voice of warning, the rebukes, the disapproval we have kept locked in our psyches over the years. In people who have a strong sense of their real selves, such undertakings do not provoke guilt. For people with an impaired real self, however, the guilt produced by this warning can be as paralysing as it was when they were 5 years old. They feel guilty about their part of themselves that wants to individuate, and not able to face the internalised guilt trip. These individuals will suppress any moves in the forbidden direction and resort to the old familiar clinging behaviour that they remember made them feel safe and good years ago. In some cases, especially among adolescents and young adults, clinging behaviour may be directed to the actual mother, and in other cases the clinging may be to another person who represents security and approval. In effect, we expect someone to take care of us like a parent, whether that person wants to or not. In either case, the false self argues convincingly that clinging is the only reliable strategy to avoid feeling guilty. Helplessness springs from the person's inability to activate his impaired real self to deal with those painful feelings. For those with some borderline traits or borderline personality disorder, which is common in those from a narcissistic family, developmental arrests of the real self and ego functions, which is the ability to tolerate frustration and have self-control, mean that the child continues to rely heavily upon primitive mechanisms of defense, denial and clinging, avoidance and distancing, projection and acting out. In order to prevent abandonment feelings, the child denies the reality of separation. Although physically he is a separate, autonomous self, he doesn't feel, think or act that way. Denial and clinging become reflexive responses fixed in the child's personality, later to become the primary means of dealing with similar separation stresses in adulthood. So that makes a lot of sense. To further assure himself that he will not trigger the abandonment depression, the child learns to avoid opportunities to express himself or assert his wishes or activate what is most unique in his personality, all of which could threaten his emotional equilibrium by precipitating his feelings of abandonment. He learns that for him, life is more tolerable when he holds himself back and avoids situations that would stimulate his own growth through self-activation and self-expression. Relinquishing control seems a small price to pay in order to feel safe. In relationships, the person will either cling or stay aloof and emotionally uninvolved out of fear of being hurt or rejected. Acting out is involved here, which is performing an extreme behaviour in order to express thoughts or feelings the person feels incapable of otherwise expressing. The behaviours will usually be considered bad or antisocial and are generally destructive to either the self or to others. Feelings are translated into actions rather than being felt, and it's an unconscious process. So, for example, typically the individual, due to his hypersensitivity to rejection, will avoid facing up to and dealing with the abandonment depression by playing out the painful parental relationship with another person cast as the parent. In this way, it is dealt with as an external problem in the present. The illusion is created that the person is managing it in the here and now. Acting out can also take the form of self-destructive behaviour, such as drinking alcohol, taking drugs, and working excessively. These serve as a distraction from the abandonment depression. In addition, people seek pleasure to avoid the pain of the abandonment depression, and a superficial feeling good means not feeling that. So, being in a dysfunctional relationship with a narcissist can help us to stay in a place where we don't self-activate, which is to connect with our authentic self and express and achieve our wants and needs. So that's for the people that end up in adulthood in relationships with narcissistic people. A cycle happens where a person wants to self-activate, they then feel the abandonment depression and move back into a defense strategy, and this can continue for years. And this is the pattern which can be really good to look at in ourselves. So self-activation triggers the abandonment depression feelings, which triggers defense, and so on and so on. I can't let go. The denial and clinging Masterson is writing about is the trauma bond, which can be likened to a person clinging to a rock in the ocean. Without the rock, we fear we will drown, as we cannot make it in life without that rock to hold on to. This feeling is the driver that keeps us in dysfunctional relationships, even as they deteriorate over time. Some people go from relationship to relationship without spending the time alone between each one. Some people have multiple relationships at once, and others have a long-term relationship lasting for many years. So again, the picture looks different for each of us. Trauma bonded yet independent. It is important to note that our personal experiences and personalities are individual, and for some, even though they are trauma bonded, they may still be very independent and very capable. We all have different levels of functioning, and we're all individuals. Reading about attachment theory and dissociation can help us to understand the concept of different parts of us, which are our different coping mechanisms, and these help to explain how our characters can seem so contradictory at times. Conclusion. The reasons for the inability to escape the trauma bond become clearer when we understand the dynamics of our relationships with others, which were shaped in childhood. Along with the effects on brain development and the nervous system, there is the long-term rewarding over many years in childhood for clinging, passive and dependent behaviours, and punishment for assertive, independent behaviours. There is the fear of abandonment and the abandonment depression, the living in an adapted self and not knowing who our real self truly is. There are the overwhelmingly strong feelings of guilt that come in which clinging to another person keeps at bay. Being in a dysfunctional relationship can help us to stay in a place where we don't self-activate, which is to connect with our authentic self. And if we do self-activate, it triggers the feelings of despair, helplessness, emptiness, guilt, and hopelessness of the abandonment depression, which in turn triggers us to go back into defense, which are defense mechanisms such as people-pleasing, etc. We may also have other core beliefs that keep us there, such as no one else would have me, if I leave, I'll be alone forever, and if there are children, I don't want my children to come from a broken home. These are the reasons we end up trauma bonded in dysfunctional relationships. So how do we move towards having healthy relationships? To move to a place where we can have healthier relationships, we need to change our relationships with ourselves. The relationships we have in our lives reflect our inner world and the way we feel about ourselves. When we don't like ourselves and when we feel a lot of guilt, shame, and a lack of self-worth, this will be reflected in our choice of partner, and our expectations of how we think we deserve to be treated will be low. We can then get to a healthier place by becoming more self-aware and recognizing patterns in our behavior which do not serve us well. And there's a link to an article here on recovering from abuse, recovering from being in a relationship with a narcissist. Therapy can help with a qualified therapist who understands trauma. And then I have a list of sources at the bottom of books these quotes have come from, and where you can find that paper about rats online. So I hope that sheds some light on how we end up in relationships, how we end up trauma bonded in relationships, trapped in these relationships, hating ourselves because we can't leave, calling ourselves, weak, pathetic on the one hand, and then also thinking that if we work harder, the relationship will be better. There are lots of thought patterns that keep us in those relationships. So I hope that video was interesting, and take care of yourselves. Have a lovely day or evening wherever you are, and bye.